Professor Tatum here to lead you through yet another lecture for History 1301. Here we will be looking at the administration of America's first president of this new republic. We are now going to see the new republic created by the U.S. Constitution in action. We'll look at a little bit of context as usual, then we'll look into Hamilton's economic plan, and we'll check out his plan in action, see what parts of it were put into action, what parts were not. Then we'll examine the strengthening of the federal image under this new constitution, and we'll overall examine the effectiveness of this new republic created by the Constitution as well. So we got to understand that coming into this new republic created by the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. still had several problems pending from their days under the Articles of Confederation. So, for example, they had a weak international image, and this was making them seem very weak and therefore making them susceptible to conquest by other European nations. But they had British troops and forts still all around the U.S. Remember, under the Treaty of Paris of 1783, Britain said, "Oh, well, we'll get rid of them in all deliberate haste." Well, they're still hanging around, and some of those British troops are encouraging some of the Indian groups who are angry with the U.S. to go attack them and provide them with guns and things like that. The British were also starting to impress U.S. sailors, and I don't mean they're showing off and showing them how cool they are. That means that they are kidnapping U.S. sailors and forcing them to join the British Navy, all right? Kind of stopping their ships, taking some of the crew members and forcing them to join their crew to help the British Navy out. Now, their justification for this was that some of their sailors had deserted to the U.S. and they're just trying to get them back. So in some cases, it was like stopping a ship and saying, "George, what are you doing over there? Come back over here." But in other cases, they were literally just stopping U.S. ships and making people come join their Navy. There were also issues, of course, with Spain that we've already seen that are still pending by the early years of the Republic. There's this unsettled border between the U.S. and Spanish Florida. Remember, Spain had regained Florida during the American Revolution. Well, that border is still unsettled. And as a result, Spain was cutting off U.S. access to that valuable port city of New Orleans. So we got to understand if the U.S. is going to transport any crops from anywhere in here, any kind of materials or people, even for that matter, they want to get them out to the Atlantic here. They're going to have to travel all across land from west to east or from north to south, depending on where they're going to get into the ocean here. And doing that on a old rugged road on a wagon is going to be very damaging. All right, it's going to be a real bumpy road, and you might damage some products or hurt some people in the process. It's a lot easier if you can get them over here to the Mississippi River. Hell, even if that means using these other rivers to get them to the Mississippi River, and then transport them out to the Gulf of Mexico and do what you got to do from there. Okay, so it would be very valuable for the U.S. to have access to this port city in New Orleans so they could utilize the Mississippi River a little better. But what are they going to do about any of this? Remember, both with their problems with Britain and their problems with Spain, under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. had no army that could do anything about this, and their federal government was too weak to really do anything about this either. There were also some pending problems from the Articles days in terms of a weak domestic image, okay? So there were still conflicts with the Northwest Confederacy in that old Northwest territory as the U.S. was trying to move into that territory there in the Northwest. So remember this confederation of various indigenous groups like the Miamis, the Shawnees, the Delawares had all been collectively resisting U.S. expansion into the Northwest Territory. This even continued into the early years of the Republic. Okay, so even in the early years of the Republic, there's a battle here that has several different names, but I think the name that's the most suiting is the Battle of 1,000 Slain, because there were nearly 1,000 American troops, both Army troops and militia troops, killed by the Northwest Confederacy in this battle. So they're really struggling here as well, and that's creating a pretty weak domestic image, and in addition to their weak international image, by not being able to do anything about their problems with Britain and with Spain. There was also, of course, in terms of their domestic image, a lot of struggles in terms of economics. Remember, there was hyperinflation and massive debt from all these different states printing their own types of money. There's no regulation of how much money they print, so some of them are printing money left and right, making that money all lose its value, and that's making it very, very difficult for the individual states, as well as for the nation as a whole, to pay off their debts from the Revolutionary War. Remember, a lot of countries like France and Spain and the Netherlands had lent some of these states, as well as the nation, a lot of money and provided them various forms of support throughout the war. Well, now they're really struggling to pay that back as a result of all this debt. Again, these are all just problems kind of bleeding over from the days of the Articles of Confederation and their inability to do anything about these issues under the government of the Articles of Confederation. So, this is kind of the context that this new nation's starting out in. We're going to have to kind of see how this new nation manages to grapple with all these things. We also need to understand that in the early years of the Republic, there was the founding of the first political parties, okay, of this first party system. This included two major parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So the Democratic Republicans, please understand, I know this name can get confusing. I use this term here. Sometimes people just call them Republicans, but I know that gets super confusing. I know we have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party here in the 21st century. We're not talking about either of those here, okay? This is a completely separate party. Now, it is in some ways a forerunner or inspiration for the later Democratic Party, but don't even try drawing direct lines or you're going to get super confused, okay? Understand this is its own party. And if it's easier for you, you can think of them or refer to them as Jeffersonians because their key leader was Thomas Jefferson, all right? Key members of this party were Jefferson, as suggested, as well as James Madison, who was the chief author of the Constitution. Now that gets real confusing for us because remember he had been a member of the Federalist faction, meaning he had supported the ratification of the Constitution, yet now he is joining the opposite party of the Federalists. Okay, same could be said here for Thomas Jefferson. This party's primary political emphasis was liberty. Remember, we talked about how there's always got to be an emphasis on either liberty, order, or equality, and emphasizing one requires de-emphasizing the others. Well, their primary emphasis here is on liberty. They also advocated a weak or limited central government, and they believed in strict construction or strict interpretation of the Constitution, basically interpreting it word for word. They're opposed to things like implying that anything could be derived or interpreted in a certain way from the Constitution. They say if it doesn't say it, you don't do it. All right. We need to understand this political party leans very heavily on the 10th Amendment. All right. The 10th Amendment, which is, of course, sometimes referred to as a states' rights amendment, suggests that any powers not granted to the federal government are therefore derived to the states and the people. Okay, so they're saying if there's anything we can't interpret from the Constitution, that's up to the states to decide. All right, so the federal government has no business acting on it whatsoever if it's not written in the Constitution. This party was primarily made up of farmers. Okay, they very heavily emphasized agriculture. They wanted to see the U.S. continue to grow as an agricultural nation. They promoted things like family farms. We'll talk about why with all of this moving forward in another lecture. But just know they're primarily agriculturalists. Last thing we need to understand about this party is their primary foreign alliance was to France. Okay, France at this time was in the middle of a revolution, and the revolutionaries were inspired, at least in theory, by a lot of the same ideas of the American revolutionaries, okay? And they seem to be promoting ideas of liberty, again, in theory. And so the Democratic Republicans offered them their sentiment and their support. They suggested the French had supported us throughout our revolution. Now let's support them through theirs. Now, on the other end of things, we have the Federalist Party under Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Keep in mind, once again, don't mix this up with the Federalist faction who supported the Constitution, and you might get a little confused. Their political emphasis in terms of political values was on order over liberty and equality, right? They promoted order. They also advocated a strong central government, and they advocated loose construction or loose interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. They believed in what were referred to as implied powers, okay? They thought that you could kind of read between the lines on certain things. So while the Democratic Republicans had leaned very heavily on that 10th Amendment, saying that the states have rights that the federal government doesn't, well, the Federalists here are going to lean very heavily on what are known as the General Welfare Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. All right. So essentially, together, those clauses can be interpreted to say that the federal government can do whatever is necessary and proper to promote the general welfare of the nation. They're going to definitely use that to their advantage to interpret the Constitution in that way. This party was primarily composed of elites who emphasized a shift toward industry. Okay, they wanted to see the U.S. become an industrial nation, and their primary foreign allegiance was to Britain. Okay, and this all really ties together. Once again, their emphasis here is on order, Well, during this French Revolution, okay, when the French had revolted against their monarch, Britain declared war on the French revolutionaries because they wanted to show the rest of Europe that this is not okay, all right? They were afraid that other people throughout Europe might start to get inspired by this revolution and they might start overthrowing their monarchs as well. The British came in to instill order. All right, they're saying, hey, if you guys start revolting left and right, you'll have to deal with us. We're going to declare war on you. So it makes sense that the Federalists, who are all about order, would promote the British, who are all about order. Okay. And we can really notice that all along the way, all their major things they're stressing with the Democratic Republicans are complete opposites. Okay. All right. Then there was the first president of this American Republic under the U.S. Constitution. That was George Washington. It was no big surprise that Washington was president. He was very popular. Remember, he had commanded the Continental Army, very well known. And when it came time to choose a president, it was pretty clear who it was going to be. People elected this guy with very little competition. George Washington's political stance was that he refused to align with either party directly, okay? Meaning he never joined either political party. And he would seek advice and work with members of both political parties, okay? He tended to lean a little more toward Federalists' ideas and policies and things like that. But he did also give some favor to the Democratic Republicans, okay? And he made it very clear he was never planning to join either party. He feared political parties, okay? He was afraid that people would start to give more allegiance to their political parties than to the nation as a whole, all right? And they'd identify more as a member of one party than as a member of a united nation. Gee, that problem sure hasn't grown out of hand by the present day, now has it? We should have listened to old George there, I guess. One thing that's worth noting as well that George Washington had to tackle pretty early on in his presidency was to found his presidential cabinet, all right? And no, I'm not talking about this kind of cabinet pictured over here. What I'm talking about is a body of advisors who would serve certain roles in government and help the president with different things. Now, the U.S. Constitution said that the president could have a body of advisors, but it didn't really lay out a lot of the groundwork for how this procedure would work. So with that in mind, George Washington could have easily said, I'm picking all these people to serve all these different roles and y'all have to deal with it. Suck it up if you don't like it. But he really believed in the principles of the Constitution, okay? And he put a self-imposed limit on his executive power. So what he did here is he selected people who he wanted to be in his cabinet, but he had the Senate approve of them. Okay, the Senate had to approve. So he's putting a limit on his own presidential power, setting that precedence for others to do so moving forward. Okay, we can see here the people he selected for his cabinet. For his Secretary of State, he chose Thomas Jefferson, who was, of course, the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. By contrast, his Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, head of the Federalist Party. So we see he's very clearly working with both parties there. And then his Secretary of War was Henry Knox, who's a Federalist as well. What I want us to understand, though, about this cabinet is it led to a standard procedure that would be used by presidents moving forward to select their cabinets, okay? This is also a clear demonstration of George Washington placing a limit on his own executive power, okay? This definitely demonstrates his true belief, his true dedication, we could say, to the principles of the U.S. Constitution. This also clearly demonstrates Washington's willingness to work with both political parties, right? He has the heads of both parties in his cabinet, all very significant. All right, so as the nation was grappling with national debt, Hamilton, as the Secretary of Treasury, was going to have to take on the responsibility of finding ways to lower that national debt. And he argued that this was something the U.S. needed to treat as a top priority because his suggestion was, as long as the U.S. was indebted to other countries, they were somewhat at the mercy of those other countries, okay? And those other countries had somewhat of an upper hand over the U.S. So he said, we need to come up with a plan ASAP. And he came up with a pretty intricate economic plan to try to pay off some of these national debts. First part of his plan was to have the federal government assume state debts. All right, so basically the national government would come in and pay off all the state's debts. Reason he wanted to do this was essentially as a power play, okay? This would put the state governments at the national government's mercy, all right? It's kind of like someday, and that day may never come, I will call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this as a gift of the day of my daughter's wedding, type of thing, right? They're doing a favor for the states, but now the states kind of owe them, right? They're at the mercy of the national government. So it certainly is a power play in a sense, but it's also helping all the individual states pay off all their debts that they've been struggling to pay all this time, helping solve part of the problem. Now, we do need to keep in mind that some of the states, especially those in the South, are going to be pretty annoyed about this because they've been working really hard to pay off as many of their state debts as they can, doing whatever they've got to do to pay off their state debts. While some of the northern states they feel have not done as much to try to pay off their debts. So they're like, gee, this sure would have been nice to know a long time ago before we busted our and sacrificed this and that to be able to pay off our state debts. Now you're going to come help us? So you can think about that kind of like if your parents all of a sudden said, you know what, guys, I've been thinking about it. I'm going to help you and your brother and sister or whatever pay off your college tuition or maybe pay off your student loans or something. And you're saying, gee, well, I've been working nights. I've been eating lots of ramen. I've been sacrificing this and that. I've been staying up so late working that it started to impact the quality of my grades at some points. And I had to find a balance between when to work and when to study and when to sleep. And here my brother's been sitting around on the couch and he's hardly working and he's scraping by with C's. And you're going to pay off both of our debts like we're on the same standing? Sure would have been nice to know before I went through all that trouble. All right. And is that really fair for him to get the same break as me? So that's something that the federal government's going to have to deal with as well. We'll see how that turns out moving forward. Hamilton also wanted to implement a protective tariff. Okay, so I know some students hear the word tariff and they say, oh no, economics and panic and shut down and stop listening. I'll break this down for you as simply as I can. A tariff is simply a tax on an imported good, okay? A tax on an imported good. That's all it is. A protective tariff tries to tax goods coming into the country in order to promote locally made goods, domestically made goods, by keeping them cheaper by making the other goods more expensive. Let's look at an example for where that might make a little more sense. Let's say we were taking this class face to face, okay? And in our classroom, I was selling pins. Maybe I'd sell you guys all pins for $1 each, okay? And anybody else who wants to come into our classroom and sell pins, they're welcome to do so, but they have to pay me a $1 tariff. And since they're paying me $1 tariff, they're going to have to charge you an extra dollar for every pin they sell you to make up for that money they're losing. So while I'm selling pins for $1 a pop, they're now having to sell all of their pins for $2 a pop, okay? If we're selling about the same quality of pins and I'm selling mine for $1, and maybe because I can afford to do that, I can cut you some kind of deals where I sell you like 2 for $1.50 or something like that. And then anybody else coming into the room is having to sell their pins for $2 because of this tariff. Who are you more likely to buy from? You're probably going to buy mine, right? Because they're cheaper. Right? That's exactly how a protective tariff works. You make foreign goods more expensive by charging them a tariff to encourage people to buy more domestic goods. And that's what Hamilton wanted to do here. He also wanted to implement a tax on liquor, okay, known as a whiskey tax. Though it did encompass more than just whiskey, it was all hard liquors. And this would be a great way to raise some federal funds to help pay off some of the debts. But we got to consider what liquor is made of, right? Whiskey is made of corn or rye, depending on what kind of whiskey it is. Vodka is made from potatoes. Gin is made from juniper berries. These are all things that farmers grow, okay? So really, a lot of farmers start making liquor or investing in liquor because it's a great, safe way to deal with their excess crops so that they're not losing their crops and they're still getting some kind of profit off of them, but it lasts much longer than the crops themselves if you make it into liquor. So considering that as farmers who are making this and growing these crops, this is specifically going to hurt farmers, this tax. But hey, Hamilton's okay with that, all right? Because remember, farmers are the key members of the Democratic Republican Party, the rival party of Hamilton's Federalist Party, right? So he's okay with weakening the support base of his rival party if that's what it takes to raise funds and support the federal government. For Hamilton, that's a win-win. Hamilton also, though, wanted to implement a national bank. So he proposed a plan to open a Bank of the United States, or a BUS, as it's sometimes called. And he suggested this would be a safe place for the federal government to store its money. But as many of you probably know, the purpose of a bank is not simply to store money. The real purpose of a bank is to loan money, okay? They actually only store a little bit of money at a time. They're really businesses who function off of loaning money, and they get a profit by charging interest on the loans that they give out. So Hamilton's thinking that in addition to helping the federal government out, this national bank could also make loans to the wealthy, so that they're not seeking loans from other nations. All right, they're seeking loans from this American-owned bank, this government-owned bank. And this would also help increase a partnership between wealthy Americans and the federal government, because wealthy Americans now have interest in seeing the US government succeed because their money's invested here in this bank. All right. And this creates a sense of partnership between the wealthiest members of society and the federal government. And that's exactly what Hamilton and the Federalists wanted to see. Hamilton also suggested that this national bank could help regulate some of the issues that had been causing the problems that were very prominent throughout the Articles of Confederation. Okay. Things like there being no standardized currency, or no control over how much money was being printed, or how much money is being circulated, right? He's saying all these things could be regulated through this national bank, all right? There could be standards set for what a dollar's worth, how much we print, how much we circulate. All these things could be helpful for combating that massive inflation that had been sweeping through the nation since the Articles of Confederation. I did not mean to go all Dr. Seuss on y'all there. That just kind of happened, okay? Sounded cool. Write that down. Another part of Hamilton's economic plan was to increase American manufacturing. He wanted to reduce dependence on foreign goods, which again could be made possible and practical and affordable if he was able to implement that protective tariffs. So that's Hamilton's economic plan in a nutshell. But there were some very significant debates as well over Hamilton's plan. So let's take a look at those. So Democratic Republicans suggested none of the things Hamilton was calling for in his economic plan were practical because they were not included in the Constitution. Okay, there's nothing in the Constitution. You guys should have read it by now. You should not have seen anything in there that says anything about the federal government being able to tax liquor, or to open a national bank, or to have protective tariffs, or to assume the state's debts. None of this stuff was there word for word in the Constitution. And again, they tied back to the 10th Amendment, saying that any powers not given to the federal government here were reserved for the states, saying if we want any of these things, this needs to be determined at the state level whether this is going to happen. So again, this is a very clear demonstration here of the Democratic Republicans interpreting the Constitution in a very strict way, right? This is an example of their strict construction. Whereas the Federalists, by contrast, came back at this and they said, well, there's other clauses within the U.S. Constitution that tell us that we can basically do what is necessary and proper to promote the general welfare of the nation. Okay, that of course again is the necessary and proper clause in the general welfare clause. And they're saying, considering the tremendous debt we're in, the fact that it's causing us rebellions, it's making our national image very weak and making us susceptible to attack by other nations, it seems pretty necessary and proper for the general welfare right now of the nation for us to do what we need to do, whatever that means. All right. So these clauses here, they're arguing, give the federal government implied powers, saying we can kind of read between the lines and see that we can do what we need to as necessary for the general welfare of the nation. This is a very clear example of the Federalists using their loose construction, their loose interpretation of the Constitution. So overall, these debates over Hamilton's economic plan pretty clearly demonstrated the differences in interpretation of the Constitution, right? They demonstrated that the Democratic Republicans interpreted the Constitution pretty strictly, while the Federalists interpreted it more loosely. So let's take a look at how Hamilton's plan went into effect. In terms of federal assumption of states' debts, that absolutely happened, but there had to be some compromise. Again, remember the South was a little annoyed that they'd been paying off their debts for the most part. And not only now are they being cut a break, while the North's being given the same credit as them, yet they feel like they haven't done as much to earn it. So the South, in return, wanted to have the capital moved to the South. So they ended up moving it to the South. Right? This is why we have Washington, D.C. now in the southern part of the country. And this is going to be very beneficial to the South. Okay, not only does this bring direct political power to the South, having the nation's capital there, but there's also all kinds of economic benefits here. If the capital is here in the South, there's going to be all kinds of politicians and ambassadors, people from all around the country and all around the world, for that matter, coming through these southern states, going in and out of the capital. And as they're traveling in and out of the capital, They're going to need places to stay. They're going to need places to eat. Some of them are going to want entertainment. They're going to need roads to travel on. They're going to need guides to get them around. And all of these things are economic opportunities for people in the South. Okay. So they ended up getting a pretty sweet deal out of this. And this is, again, why we have the capital where we do in the present day. The protective tariff did not go through. Even George Washington, who normally supported Hamilton on most things, said, nah, we're not doing this, okay? They had too many benefits from getting goods from other places, all right? They were manufactured goods from other countries that the U.S. just was not quite ready to produce for itself yet, and to make it more difficult for people to get a hold of those things and make it more expensive just didn't seem practical at this moment. The whiskey tax did pass, but at a pretty big cost. A lot of farmers, as I suggested they would be, were pretty upset by this tax. And some farmers started to rebel. Some of them even started doing things like tarring and feathering tax collectors who were coming to collect the whiskey tax. And the federal government was really annoyed about this rebellion, especially when it got armed. It started getting a little more intense. And they said, we don't have room for this kind of rebellion here. You know, when we were doing things like protesting against tax collectors during the American Revolution, it was because we were being taxed without representation. You have no business doing that now because you have representation. Why are you doing this? All right. And to shut down this rebellion, President Washington led troops and shut down this rebellion, okay, directly. This very clearly shows us that there's been a big change since Shays' Rebellion. Remember, under Shays' Rebellion, the federal government kind of had to sit back and watch while the rebellion played out because they didn't really have the authority or the manpower to come in and do anything about it. Well, now in this new republic under the Constitution, there's a new army. The federal government has a little more power, and George Washington came in and cracked down very quickly. Okay, this very clearly demonstrates not only somewhat of a shift toward order, very secondary to the bigger picture it demonstrates, which is that there's a much stronger and effective government now under the U.S. Constitution than there had been under the Articles of Confederation. All right, we're seeing a stronger, more capable government overall here under this republic. Pretty historically significant. The National Bank also was established. Okay, the first bank of the United States was established. And to appease some of the critics and people who were skeptical of how this bank might be abused by the wealthy and the government working together, they decided that they would only charter, meaning fund and support, this bank for 20 years. All right, so they give it a set amount of time for it to operate. And if after that 20 years, enough people collectively agreed that, hey, this is becoming something that the government and the wealthy are using in a tyrannical type of way, and it's not really being used appropriately, then they could just not renew the charter. Boom, the bank would shut down. But if after that 20 years had passed and they said, hey, this bank is actually seeming like it's helping us out economically, they could renew the charter and keep it running. So we're definitely seeing some progress being made toward addressing the economic concerns that the new republic was faced with. Let's take a look at how they worked on strengthening their federal image, which was very weak by the time the republic was up and running following the years of the Articles of Confederation. So, of course, we've seen already Washington took a pretty firm stance against the Whiskey Rebellion. That was certainly one step in strengthening the domestic image, showing that this federal government was capable of dealing with rebellions and shutting them down. All right, demonstrating a pretty capable national government, much more firm, much more powerful now here under the U.S. Constitution. But another way they dealt with the domestic image was by grappling with the Northwest Confederacy out in the old Northwest. Now, again, I'm having to use some empathy, not sympathy here. I'm not suggesting that the U.S. should have been trying to push people out of their homelands. I'm simply saying it's what happened, and that's what the U.S. wanted to happen. To really crack down on the Northwest Confederacy, Washington led a commander named Mad Anthony Wayne to go push the Northwest Confederacy out of the territory in a battle known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Now, that name alone, Mad Anthony Wayne, doesn't instill discipline into you. The man himself would, okay? That was his job, as he was coming in to kick the army into gear, all right? He drilled them and drilled them and drilled them until they were ready for battle, and then he led them into the old Northwest, and he led this deadly assault against the Northwest Confederacy, in which he defeated him. A little side note on this that I left out in my face-to-face classes, but since I'm on here, we got a little time, I'm going to go ahead and get into it. A lot of these members of the Northwest Confederacy had believed that they had alliances with the British. The British had kind of encouraged them to cause trouble for the U.S., and some of these nations of the Northwest Confederacy were under the understanding that the British would back them up as necessary. So, as they were retreating from this battle, some members of the Northwest Confederacy went to a nearby British fort and went knocking on the doors trying to get in and seek refuge, and the British did not let them in. Okay, pretty devastating. And this battle, though, was ended by the Treaty of Grenville. And the way this worked was some U.S. officials coerced certain members of the Northwest Confederacy to sign a treaty agreeing to move out of the Northwest Territory and allow the U.S. to move in. All right. So they were agreeing to move out to the West and allow the U.S. to move in and assume control of the territory. Problem was, not all of the leaders of all of the nations who should have been consulted for this to have been valid were consulted. And this would kind of set the foundation for the U.S. Indian policy moving forward. Okay, so this would lead to a continued type of cycle in terms of how the U.S. would deal with indigenous peoples. And this would also lead to continued, we could say, Indian removal that followed this same type of pattern. It really set a precedence for future Indian removal. And to really kind of understand how this all worked, let's put it into a contemporary perspective. So assume that I called you into emergency office hours and I said, things really are not looking good for you, okay? The almighty power of my class is about to inevitably overwhelm you, and you are destined to fail. And I don't want to see that happen, so I'll make you a deal. I'll put together this big, extensive test you can take in place of finishing the class, okay? It'll have maybe 10 essay questions and 100 ID terms, and you'll have 2 weeks to study and be prepared for it. And as long as you pass that test, you pass the class instead of sitting here and failing like you will inevitably. Okay. And you think about it, you say, well, that sounds like a real pain in the not too. But, if you let yourself fail, then that could really mess with your GPA. That could mess with your financial aid. That'll set up your degree plan. That could really cause you some problems. Okay. So maybe it is in your best interest to go through with this test. Now it's a real pain, but you think you can do it. So you say, okay, I agree. I'll take the test. And I say, okay, I just need you to sign this paper here saying that you agree to take this test. Don't worry about the fine print. That's all just malarkey that the university makes me put in there. Just a bunch of bureaucratic mumbo jumbo. Don't worry about it. And so you sign this agreement. And then I contact the entire class saying, hey guys, I hope y'all are ready for your big 10 essay question, 100 ID term test coming up. And I say, what are you talking about? And so, yeah, I have this signed piece of paper from one of your classmates saying that you've all agreed to this. When that one student really had no authority to speak for all of you, I'm allowing their decision that I coerced them into agreeing to hold all of you accountable. All right. Very similar circumstances here. Okay. They would convince these indigenous peoples, certain groups of them, hey, it's inevitable that white Americans are going to start moving out into this territory and they're very land hungry and it's inevitable that they're going to kill you. And many of them are much more powerful than you and they have all kinds of advantages over you. And I don't want to see you and your kids get hurt. So it's really best if you just agree to move out of here peacefully, okay? Maybe we can even work out a deal where we give you some rations and things like that for your troubles. And, those few individuals say, okay, I guess that's the best option because I don't want me or my kids to get killed. It sounds like this is inevitable. And then they would sign their agreement. And then the entire Confederacy in this case, not even just one nation, the entire Confederacy here was kind of expected to just pack up and leave. All right. So what we do see here, though, regardless of whether or not we agree with the morality of this certainly does demonstrate a stronger federal image as well, right? This is a clear demonstration that the U.S. is now more capable of dealing with issues that it had been unable to deal with under the Articles of Confederation. Another way we can see the U.S. demonstrating a stronger international image in this new republic under the Constitution is through the way that they did end up dealing with some of the international issues they were having. Okay, so remember, for example, with Britain, the U.S. had been struggling with them having their troops and their forts still around, having some of their troops cause trouble with some of the local Indian tribes. They also had British sailors causing trouble for U.S. sailors. So the U.S. sent a diplomat named John Jay to go negotiate a treaty to attempt to ease tensions with Britain. And what the British agreed to in this treaty was a few things. All right, they agreed to stop harassing U.S. ships, remove all their forts from the U.S. And all their soldiers from the U.S. But they were already supposed to have done these two things here, remove their forts and their soldiers, under the Treaty of Paris of 1783. As far as harassing other nations' ships out in the seas, no nation should ever be harassing another nation's ships out of the sea. All right, that is kind of just a given that that's not something one country should be doing to another country. So they're kind of agreeing to do things that they really should have been doing all along. Oh, but don't worry, it gets better. In exchange for Britain agreeing to do these things, the U.S. had to agree to give up trade rights in the Caribbean. So, in short, the U.S. is having to give up something in order for the British to do what they should have been doing all along. Now, I think this is why one of my colleagues refers to Jay's Treaty as one of the dumbest treaties in U.S. history. I can definitely see why. But regardless of how ridiculous the terms of this treaty might seem, this treaty did help ease some of the concerns that the U.S. had been having, and once again demonstrated that they were capable of solving their domestic issues internationally. Now, spoiler alert, some of these things are only going to turn out to be temporary. Britain's going to come back and start causing some of these same problems later down the road. But for now, at least they're making some progress toward easing these concerns they've been having, demonstrating that they're now more capable of dealing with international affairs than they had been under the Articles of Confederation. But we need to understand that this led to other nations assuming that there must have been some kind of secret deal under the table between the U.S. and Britain, all right? So, for example, Spain assumed there must have been something more going on here, okay? They said there's no way the U.S. would agree to give anything up in exchange for the things that Britain's agreed to here. There must be something else to this treaty that they're not making public. Now, there was no secret agreement. If the treaty really was this bad, but it led to Spain assuming that there must have been some kind of maybe secret alliance formed between Britain and the U.S. And this had Spain very concerned because remember, they've been having some issues with the U.S. in terms of things like the disputes over the border with Florida and cutting U.S. access off to New Orleans. Now they're worrying, if we keep pissing off the U.S., is Britain going to come after us? All right, they're thinking, well, we could probably take on the U.S., but I don't know if we can handle Britain again. All right, we don't want to have to go to war with them if we can avoid it. So why don't we, just for good measure, be safe and make sure to ease up relations with the U.S., all right? And it was that kind of mindset that led Spain to be open to negotiate with the U.S. under what was known as Pinckney's Treaty. And under Pinckney's Treaty, the U.S. and Spain resolved a lot of their concerns they'd been having. This treaty established a firm border between Spanish Florida and the U.S. I don't care that you know it's at the 31st parallel. I just want you to see under Pinckney's Treaty, there was a firm border established. This also allowed the U.S. to get access to New Orleans, which, of course, as I suggested before, was very beneficial to trade and transportation for the U.S. So again here, this is a clear demonstration of the U.S. now being more capable of dealing with international affairs under the U.S. Constitution than it had been under the Articles of Confederation, showing us a much stronger central government that's more capable of doing what it needs to do. All right, so when Washington finished up his second term, he decided that he had done enough time and he was going to retire, all right? So he was very popular. He had a lot of political power at this time, a lot of influence. He very easily could have continued to run for more elections throughout the remainder of his life, or he could have just said from here, really, like we've seen in a lot of other countries throughout history, at this point he could have said, you know what, I don't think I really need to abide by the Constitution anymore. At this point, I'm going to make myself supreme ruler, right? He could have become King Washington or something like that. But he was a firm believer in the principles of the Constitution. So he decided that after 2 terms, hey, I've done my time. I'm going to go enjoy my old age. We need some fresh blood in here, all right? We're not interested in having any kind of monarchy, any kind of long-term rule. I'm going to give up my own power here. Again, this is another example of him putting a self-imposed limit on his own executive power. Pretty fascinating. All right, so let's recap here. What all we saw. So throughout the first administration of this new republic created by the Constitution, the U.S. had managed to grapple with some of their economic problems through Hamilton's economic plan. They also managed to effectively handle some domestic affairs, okay, things like the Whiskey Rebellion and their conflicts with the Northwest Confederacy. And they'd also managed to settle their international affairs. On one hand, with Jay's Treaty, they handled their disputes with Britain. Even if it was in a pretty stupid way, they did manage to come to some negotiations with Britain, demonstrating that their new government was effective in dealing with diplomacy. And they also successfully negotiated access to New Orleans with Spain and settled that border dispute under Pinckney's Treaty. Furthermore, we saw Washington establishing some traditions that would continue to be followed, all right, that stood within the groundwork of the Constitution and its ideals, okay? He even put some self-inflicted checks on his own executive power, very much falling in line with the ideals of the Constitution. All these things together seem to clearly demonstrate that this new government was working, okay? And it's much more effective than the government that was operating under the Articles of Confederation. All right, guys, we'll see where things go from here. And our next lecture, we'll continue to look into the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, see what their disputes led to and what members of each party got into in the early republic and how that impacted life for individuals living in the early republic. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here for now. Please let me know if you got any questions. Otherwise, over and out.